My name is Brooke Merritt, and I'm 35 years old. 6 days after we buried my mother, my older brother replaced every lock on the house where I grew up. Then he carried my daughter's belongings outside and left them on the front porch while rain poured from the sky. By the time I arrived, Nora's little sneakers were soaked through. Her stuffed rabbit lay face down in a muddy puddle. Garrett stood in the doorway, our father's doorway, the entrance to a house that had belonged to the Merritt family since 1890. He looked me straight in the eye and said I wasn't family anymore. "The land belongs to the Merritt son," he said coldly. "Daughters leave when they marry. You should have accepted that years ago." Then he smiled. "You'd better get used to being homeless." He proudly told me he'd already made sure I wouldn't receive a single thing. What Garrett didn't know, what he never imagined, was that my mother had added one final clause to her will. And when our attorney stood in that conference room and read those final pages aloud, when he announced my actual net worth in front of relatives who had spent my entire life treating me like the child who never mattered, my brother collapsed to the floor. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quiet ones don't need to shout because the paperwork speaks loud enough. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child, the extra child, the one everyone overlooked, this story is for you. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you live. And if you enjoy stories where justice arrives one document at a time, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let me take you to Marietta, Ohio, a town of roughly 8,000 people where your last name can matter almost as much as your character. Marietta sits where the Muskingum River meets the Ohio River. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your grandparents, remembers your high school grades, and notices if you switched church pews on Sunday morning. For generations, the Merritt family had been part of that town's history. My great-grandfather opened Merritt and Son Woodworks back in 1947, and the hand-carved walnut sign still hangs above the storefront on 3rd Street. My father, Tom Merritt, spent 31 years running that shop. He could build beautiful furniture with his hands. Understanding his daughter, that was another story. There were only 2 children in our family. Me. And my brother Garrett, who was 6 years older. He was the firstborn son. The heir. The child whose name naturally belonged beside Merritt and Son. From the beginning, our futures were decided for us. Garrett finished school each afternoon and went straight to the workshop. I followed my mother, Ruth, into the kitchen. He learned woodworking, blueprints, and machinery. I learned recipes, laundry, and how to stay quiet whenever adults were talking. Dad had one sentence he repeated so often it became part of the furniture. Every Thanksgiving, every tax season, every conversation about the family business, he'd say, "The land stays with the Merritt son. Girls marry out." He never sounded angry. He said it the same way someone says winter follows autumn. To him, it wasn't opinion. It was simply the natural order of things. Mom would quietly pass another bowl of mashed potatoes. I'd look down at my plate and count peas instead of answering. When I turned 15, I finally gathered enough courage to ask, "Dad, could I work at the shop on Saturdays?" He looked at me with genuine confusion. "What for?" Then he shrugged. "You're not staying here." 3 years later, I left Marietta carrying one duffel bag and a flat carpenter's pencil Dad had given me when I was 9 years old. The wide wooden kind every carpenter keeps tucked behind an ear. I still remembered the afternoon he handed it to me. He slipped it behind my ear, smiled for just a second, and said, "There. Now you look like a Merritt." It was the only time in my entire childhood he ever made me feel like I truly belonged. I kept that pencil. Not because it was valuable, because it reminded me of the one moment I felt seen. I enrolled at Ohio State, earned a degree in accounting, then completed a master's specializing in forensic accounting. Most people don't know what forensic accountants actually do. We follow money. We trace shell corporations, fake invoices, hidden transfers, and financial fraud until every missing dollar tells the truth. I discovered I had a talent for it. A real one. By 26, I was helping investigate fraud cases that regularly appeared on national news. 3 years later, I founded my own company, Merritt Forensic Group. At first it was just me, then 3 employees, then 8, eventually 22. I built everything from a tiny rented office above a sandwich shop on High Street. Every client, every contract, every success. I earned all of it myself. Back home, Garrett called it my calculator job. Dad described it as something I'd do until I settled down. Mom never asked about business. She only wanted to know whether I was eating enough. Nobody in Marietta understood forensic accounting. Most didn't care. Family dinners always followed the same pattern. Garrett talked about expanding the woodworking shop or buying another property to renovate. Dad listened with complete attention. If I mentioned uncovering a 7-figure fraud for a Fortune 500 company, he'd smile politely. "That's nice, Brooke. Could you pass the rolls?" Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. I stopped talking about my company, my clients, my accomplishments. Instead, I carried that old carpenter's pencil inside my purse. Whenever I touched the smooth cedar wood, I remembered the smell of fresh sawdust inside Dad's workshop. I wasn't holding on to the past. I was reminding myself that even if nobody else believed I belonged in the Merritt family, I'd already proven it to myself. By 2023, after selling the majority ownership of my company, my personal net worth had quietly climbed beyond $5 million. No one in my hometown had any idea. They assumed I rented a tiny apartment and drove an aging Honda because I couldn't afford anything better. The truth was much simpler. I liked my Honda. Nobody ever bothered asking. 14 months ago, my father died. A heart attack. He was feeding a piece of white oak through the planer on an ordinary Tuesday morning when his heart suddenly failed. The paramedics later said he was gone before he ever reached the floor. I received the phone call while sitting at my desk in Columbus. My business partner, Gwen, insisted on driving because my hands shook too badly to hold the steering wheel. By the time we reached Marietta, Garrett had already taken center stage. He stood in the living room greeting visitors, accepting condolences, and shaking hands with members of the Rotary Club. He'd even changed into a blazer. He looked like someone who had been rehearsing to become head of the Merritt family his entire life. While he accepted sympathy, I handled everything else. The funeral home, death certificates, insurance paperwork, church arrangements, obituary details. Mom was too devastated to think clearly. Garrett was too busy looking like the perfect grieving son to actually do the work a grieving son should have done. I didn't complain. I rarely do. If I notice something that needs doing, I do it. If everyone steps back, I step forward. My therapist calls it over-responsibility, the habit of carrying every burden yourself because nobody ever taught you it was okay to set one down. After the funeral, though, I noticed something unusual. My mother scheduled a private meeting with Raymond Voss, the family's estate attorney, at his office on 3rd Street. Mom went to Voss's office on Maple Street by herself. When she came home, she wasn't her usual self. She was quieter, but there was a calm determination in her eyes, like she'd finally made peace with a difficult choice. I asked if everything was all right. She gently patted my hand and said, "Your father's affairs are more complicated than you think. Voss is handling everything." I didn't ask any more questions. Looking back, I know I should have. But Nora needed me, my company depended on me, and my mother looked like she wanted to carry this burden on her own. So I let her. 6 weeks ago, Ruth suffered a stroke. She had been outside in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds she'd cared for ever since I was a child, when suddenly something in her brain failed. A neighbor discovered her lying face down among the marigolds. She was rushed to Marietta Memorial Hospital, but passed away just 3 hours later. Within 20 minutes of receiving the call, I was already driving there. Nora sat silently in the back seat, watching the Ohio countryside blur past the windows. She didn't say a word. 7-year-olds somehow understand when pain is simply too big to put into words. The funeral was held at First Congregational Church, where 4 generations of the Merritt family had been baptized, married, and laid to rest. Nearly 100 people attended. Garrett delivered the eulogy. Standing behind the pulpit in what looked like a charcoal-colored Tom Ford suit, he spoke for 12 straight minutes. He talked about the honor of carrying the Merritt family name. He praised the family business. He spoke proudly about following in the footsteps of our father and grandfather. He mentioned Ruth's wonderful cooking. He praised her beautiful garden. But he never mentioned that she had spent the last 14 months living alone in that house, carrying a heartbreaking loneliness no one should ever have to bear by themselves. And he never mentioned me. After the service, everyone gathered in the fellowship hall. Ruth's younger sister, Aunt Carol, gently pulled me aside and squeezed my arm. "It was a beautiful service," she said. "Your father would have been so proud of Garrett." For a brief moment, I almost laughed. Instead, I stayed quiet. As I helped Nora zip up her jacket near the coat rack, a man wearing a gray wool suit walked over. It was Raymond Voss. At 66, he looked as dry and precise as chalk dust, the kind of attorney who measured every word with the same care a pharmacist measures medicine. "Stay in town," he said softly. "After Garrett's problems, your father revised his will. You'll want to hear those changes. Both of you should be there." He gave a small nod and walked away. 6 days after the funeral, Garrett finally called. I was standing in my parents' kitchen, my mother's kitchen, making oatmeal for Nora. Morning sunlight poured through the window above the sink exactly as it always had, flat and golden, illuminating tiny particles of dust drifting through the air. "You need to be out by Friday," Garrett said. There wasn't even a greeting. "No, how are you?" Just a demand, delivered like a contractor announcing a deadline. "Excuse me?" I asked. "The house belongs to me," he replied. "Dad made that clear for 30 years. Probate is nothing more than paperwork. Voss will confirm it. I need you and the kid out before Friday so Sloan and I can start renovating." The kid. That's what he called my daughter. The kid. The will hasn't even been read yet. I reminded him. "There's nothing to read," Garrett answered. "You already know the family rule. The land goes to the Merritt son." You walked away. I stayed. That's the end of it. In the background, I heard Sloane's cheerful, cutting voice. "Tell her Friday, babe." I tightened my grip on the kitchen counter. Nora looked at me from the table, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. "I'm not leaving until Voss reads the will," I said firmly. Garrett didn't hesitate. "Then you'll leave with nothing." Then he spoke the next sentence with frightening confidence, as if he'd practiced it over and over before finally saying it aloud. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Brooke. I made sure you don't get a single thing." The call ended. I quietly placed my phone face down on the counter. Then I finished making Nora's oatmeal. I sat down across from my daughter, and we ate breakfast together. Because when someone tries to pull the ground out from beneath your feet, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep standing and eat your breakfast. That evening, I slipped my key into the front door. It wouldn't turn. The locks had already been replaced. The old brass key attached to its cracked leather keychain, the one my father handed me when I turned 18, saying, "For whenever you need to come home," no longer opened the door. The key my father had given me on my 18th birthday, the one he had placed in my hand while saying, "This is for whenever you come home," slid into the lock, turned halfway, and stopped. It was useless. When I walked around to the front of the house, my belongings were already waiting on the porch. 3 flimsy cardboard moving boxes, the inexpensive kind sold at the hardware store on Pike Street. Inside them were Nora's clothes, my suitcase, and Ruth's old recipe tin, the one she'd promised would someday belong to me. It was filled with handwritten recipe cards she'd carefully collected over 40 years. Everything sat soaking in nearly half an inch of rainwater on the same wooden porch where my mother used to enjoy her coffee every morning. The front door swung open. Sloane stepped outside wrapped in a cream-colored cashmere shawl, casually holding a glass of Syrah as though she were greeting guests at an upscale gallery event. "Oh," she said, looking at me the way someone looks at a delivery driver standing at the wrong address. "You're still here." I ignored the remark. "Where's Nora's room?" I asked. "What happened to her books?" Sloane barely reacted. "Garrett packed everything that belonged to you, or her. Honestly, Brooke, this was never really Nora's home. She's been here, what for times?" She said it as though belonging depended on geography, as if a 7-year-old child had to earn the right to call her grandmother's house home. Something settled inside me at that moment. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Without saying another word, I carried the boxes to my car, placed them carefully in the trunk, buckled Nora into her booster seat, then walked back toward the porch. Sloane was still there, slowly sipping her wine, watching me as though she were enjoying a performance. I met her eyes. "You can keep the locks," I said calmly. "You can keep every room inside this house. But you will never speak about my daughter like that again. Not to me. Not to Garrett. Not to anyone in this town." I paused. "That isn't a request." The smile on Sloane's face faded instantly. Without another word, she stepped back inside and quietly closed the door. I climbed into the driver's seat. Nora clutched her damp stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. "Where are we going, Mom?" she asked softly. I didn't know, so I simply started driving. Eventually, we checked into the Riverview Motel on Route 7, about a mile outside town. $49 a night, 2 double beds, a microwave, and a window overlooking the parking lot with the river beyond it. To Nora, it felt like an exciting adventure. She bounced happily across one of the beds and asked if we could order pizza. I told her yes. It was the only thing I could say without my voice breaking. I sat quietly on the edge of the other bed, staring down at my phone. I still owned a condo in Columbus. I had a successful career there. I had built a good life for myself. I could have packed Nora into the car, driven 2 hours west, and never returned to Marietta again. Garrett could keep the house. He could have the family business, the sign, the property, the entire crumbling legacy. I didn't need any of it. I'd already created my own future. But Raymond Voss had asked me to stay. He told me my father had changed the will, and my mother, Ruth, had met privately with Voss after the first funeral. When she returned, she looked like someone who had finally laid down a burden she'd carried for decades. I owed it to her to hear whatever my father had left behind. And if I was completely honest, Marietta was the only place where Nora had ever known her grandparents. She loved the backyard filled with marigolds. She loved the Riverside Trail, where my father used to take me fishing every Saturday morning, long before he decided I no longer deserved his time. She especially loved the 18 acres stretching down to the river, where the old boathouse rested beneath towering sycamore trees. She always called it the River Place. So I stayed. Not to fight. Not to prove anyone wrong. I stayed because Voss had asked me to. Because my mother would have wanted me to hear the truth. And because my daughter deserved to experience this town the way I once had, before carrying the Merritt name only mattered if you were born a son. Raymond Voss's office occupied the second floor of an old limestone building on 3rd Street, just 3 doors away from the family shop. The stairway carried the scent of old books mixed with lemon furniture polish. His walnut desk had been built years earlier by my grandfather. Behind him stood shelves lined with 40 years' worth of Ohio Revised Code volumes, alongside a framed photograph showing him shaking hands with my father at a Rotary Club dinner sometime in the 90s. "Sit down, Brooke," he said, motioning toward the leather chair across from his desk. He never wasted time with small talk. I appreciated that. "The formal reading of the will is scheduled for next Thursday. Both you and Garrett must attend." I frowned. "Required?" He nodded. "Your father's will contains a provision that can only be carried out if both of his children are present. As executor, I have no choice but to follow those instructions." I leaned closer. "Voss, what exactly did my father change?" He folded his hands carefully across the desk before speaking. "After your brother's financial troubles, after your father guaranteed certain debts and reorganized several financial obligations, Tom amended part of his will." He paused briefly. He placed a condition on one specific asset. "Which one?" "The 18 acres along the river, including the old boathouse." My chest tightened immediately. "The River Place. What kind of condition?" Voss looked directly at me. "Both beneficiaries must submit verified financial statements before ownership of that property can be transferred." He continued. "Your father wanted documented, certified proof that whoever inherited that land could keep it without borrowing against it, mortgaging it, or eventually losing it to creditors." He fell silent for a moment. Then he quietly added, "Your father finally learned something, Brooke. It took him a long time, but he learned it. I looked at him. What did he learn? Voss picked up a heavy silver pen engraved with his initials and tapped it once against the desk. That the loudest person in the room isn't always the person who should be trusted with the keys. He rose to his feet. Thursday, 10 o'clock. Bring every financial document you have. And make sure Garrett is there too. My Honda Civic was parked between an old pickup and a family minivan. No one in Marietta had ever seen what was inside my investment portfolio, and the truth was, nobody had ever cared enough to ask. They never asked. Gwen said. I shook my head. And you never told them? No. She tilted her head. Why not? I sat quietly for a moment. The real answer wasn't simple. Part of it was pride. Part of it was stubbornness. And part of it was the lingering hurt from years of hearing that my career wasn't a real career at all. But underneath all of that was one undeniable truth. Because I shouldn't have to prove my worth to people who decided I had none before I was even old enough to speak. Gwen exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair. I can't argue with that, she admitted. But Brooke, if the will gets read and there's something important involved, those numbers might end up speaking whether you want them to or not. 2 days before the estate meeting, I drove by the old house on Maple Lane to check on my mother's garden. It had become a habit I couldn't seem to break. The marigolds were already beginning to wither. No one had watered them since the funeral. But the flowers weren't what caught my attention. A man in his mid-40s stood on the front porch, wearing a polo shirt embroidered with a local bank's logo. He was talking through the screen door to Garrett, whose voice sounded nothing like its usual confident self. It'll be covered by the estate, Garrett insisted. As soon as probate is finished, I'll have access to everything. You'll get your money. The banker remained calm. Mr. Merritt, this is the third notice we've sent. The balance on the second mortgage is now seriously overdue. I told you, Garrett snapped. The estate will handle it. Just then, he noticed my car parked across the street. The worry disappeared from his face almost instantly, replaced by pure anger. He stormed outside, slammed the screen door behind him, and the banker quietly walked back to his sedan without another word. I didn't wave. I didn't roll down my window. I simply watched. A second mortgage? On the same house Garrett had already claimed as his own. The same house he'd thrown me and Nora out of. The same property he believed was his birthright. As I sat there, one of my father's old sayings drifted back into my mind. Unlike many of his opinions, this one had always stayed with me. A man who borrows against his foundation is standing over a trapdoor. For years I'd assumed he was talking about protecting the woodworking business from debt. Now, watching the banker's car disappear down Maple Lane, I began to wonder if he'd actually been talking about Garrett all along. I returned to the motel, without stopping anywhere else. The toolbox stayed closed that night, too. Something deep inside kept telling me not to open it until I was ready to face whatever my father had left behind. But I was running out of excuses. The evening before the reading of the will, I finally decided it was time. Nora had already fallen asleep. The motel room was silent except for the steady hum of the mini refrigerator and the occasional rumble of trucks passing along Route 7. I placed the old green metal toolbox on the bed and released the worn brass latch. Inside were the familiar tools from my childhood: a coping saw, a small hand plane, several marking gauges. Beneath them, tucked neatly against the metal lining as though someone had hidden them on purpose, were 3 items. Those 3 items changed everything. The first was a carpenter's pencil. Not the one I'd carried for years. This one looked freshly sharpened. Scratched along its flat side, in my father's cramped handwriting, were the initials. TM-BM. Tom Merritt to Brooke Merritt. It looked less like a label and more like a passing of the torch. The second item was a brass key. Its shape reminded me of the key hanging from my old leather keychain, the one that no longer fit the front door. But this key was different. Smaller. Older. A metal tag had been wired through the bow. Stamped into the tag were 4 words: Boathouse, Back Acres. It wasn't the key to the family home. It belonged to the old boathouse sitting on 18 acres beside the river. The place where Dad had taken me fishing when I was little. The same place Nora always called the river house. The third item was a folded legal document. I unfolded it carefully. It was a lien notice from First Federal Savings. 3 years earlier, my father had taken out a second mortgage against the Maple Lane property. Amount financed: $340,000. His signature appeared at the bottom of the page. Written in pencil across the margin were 7 words. Brooke, ask Voss about the back acres. I read the sentence twice. Then I picked up my phone. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night when I called Raymond Voss. He answered before the second ring finished. You found the lien notice, he said. It wasn't a question. $340,000, I replied. Against the house. Yes. Silence hung between us before he continued. Your father refinanced the property to pay off Garrett's debts. I closed my eyes. What debts? Garrett's speculative housing project failed. He overextended himself on 2 developments in Williamstown and borrowed money from private lenders charging extremely high interest. Your father had guaranteed the original loans. When everything collapsed, he refinanced the family home to consolidate the debt. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, gripping the phone. So the house Garrett threw me out of is carrying substantial debt, Voss finished. There's very little equity remaining. He paused before adding another piece. The woodworking shop also has a separate lien, around $40,000 owed to an unpaid supplier. I felt my stomach tighten. So, altogether, the house and shop your brother expects to inherit carry nearly $380,000 in secured debt. He let the numbers settle before continuing. The combined property is worth roughly $400,000 in today's market. So, he's inheriting almost nothing. If property values remain stable, he'll barely break even. And if they fall, he could end up underwater. I looked again at the lien notice resting in my lap. Then my eyes returned to the handwritten note. Ask Voss about the back acres. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together. The 18 acres beside the river. They were the only property my father still owned outright. The only asset in the estate that carried no debt at all was the back acres. No liens, no mortgages, just 18 acres of riverfront land with a recent appraisal of about $1.1 million. Voss explained everything carefully. Your father knew that if he left this property directly to Garrett, it would probably be mortgaged within a year. That's why he added one final condition. I listened quietly. Both children must submit verified financial statements. The land goes to whichever child can prove they have the financial ability to keep it debt-free. I nodded. Dead hand control. I'd seen the term countless times while working forensic estate cases. Exactly, Voss replied. Ohio courts routinely enforce conditional inheritances like this. He paused before speaking again. Your father learned a difficult lesson, Brooke. But in the end, he did learn it. After we hung up, I sat alone for several minutes, turning the brass key over in one hand while holding my father's carpenter's pencil in the other. The following morning, Voss contacted both Garrett and me to explain the requirement officially. Garrett reacted instantly. Even through separate phone lines, I could hear him raising his voice. A financial statement? Fine. I'll submit one. I've got absolutely nothing to hide. The truth was, he had $380,000 worth of things to hide. But Garrett had always mistaken confidence for competence, and this situation was no different. By lunchtime, his verified financial statement had already been delivered to Voss. A few minutes later, my phone rang. Just so you know, Garrett said, unable to hide the smugness in his voice, my paperwork is already in. By tomorrow evening, that land will officially be mine. He laughed. I stayed here. I ran Dad's business. I carried the Merritt name. Some spreadsheet isn't going to erase 30 years of everyone knowing who the real heir is. Okay, I replied. He sounded almost disappointed. That's it? You're just going to say okay? What would you like me to say? A brief silence followed. I'd like you to admit the land was always meant for me. That's how this family works. That's how it's always worked. Across the motel room, Nora sat at the little desk drawing a picture of the river with a green crayon. I watched her for a moment before answering. I understand exactly how this family works. I'll see you tomorrow, Garrett muttered before hanging up. The moment the call ended, I dialed Gwen. I need a verified financial statement by 5 o'clock today. The whole portfolio? Everything. CPA certification. Net worth summary on the front page. There was a brief pause. So, you're really doing this? I'm doing the last thing my father ever asked me to do. I'll have it ready in 3 hours. That evening, after Nora fell asleep, I sat alone in the motel parking lot. The engine was off. The windows were down. Half a mile away, the Ohio River moved quietly through the darkness. On calm nights like this, you could actually hear it, a soft, steady sound that made the whole town seem alive. The truth was, I didn't need those 18 acres. I already had financial security. I had a successful career. I had a healthy daughter who would thrive whether we lived in Columbus or anywhere else in the world. The logical side of me, the forensic accountant who made difficult financial decisions every day, kept saying the same thing. Walk away. Let Garrett have the property. If he borrowed against it, lost it, or watched the bank auction it off, that wasn't my responsibility. But another part of me refused to listen. It remembered early mornings beside the river. My father teaching me how to tie fishing knots. The sycamore trees turning gold every October. The creak of the old boathouse door swinging open on rusty hinges. Dad had written my initials on that carpenter's pencil. He'd hidden the boathouse key inside the toolbox. He'd written, "Ask Voss about the back acres," and tucked the note where only I would ever find it. None of those things happened by accident. They were instructions. The final wishes of a man who had spent most of his life believing the wrong things and only realized the truth when there was almost no time left. I picked up my phone and texted Gwen. Send the financial statement to Voss. Her reply came less than a minute later. Already sent. Certified net worth, $5.83 million. Verified by Kowalski and Associates, independent CPA. You're officially on record. I stared toward the river. This wasn't about defeating Garrett. It was about honoring the final request my father ever made of me. If doing that also proved every assumption he'd ever made about daughters was wrong, well, numbers have never lied. The morning of the will reading, there was a knock at my motel room door just after 7. When I opened it, Sloane stood there dressed as though she were headed to an upscale brunch. Silk blouse, linen trousers, a designer Tory Burch tote hanging from her shoulder. In one hand, she carried a large manila envelope. "Can we talk?" she asked with a practiced smile. Woman to woman. I stepped aside and let her in. Nora was brushing her teeth in the bathroom. Sloane sat on the edge of the bed, opened the envelope, and slid a document across the comforter. "It's a quitclaim deed," she explained. "Garrett asked me to bring it." She looked directly at me. "If you sign this, you'll give up every claim to the estate. The house, the land, everything. And in return, Garrett will pay you $15,000. She smiled again. "And you'll receive all of Ruth's personal photographs." I picked up the paperwork. 4 neatly printed pages. Already notarized on Garrett's side. He hadn't prepared this overnight. He'd planned it well in advance. $15,000, I repeated. "And the family photos." "It's a generous offer, Brooke," Sloane replied smoothly. "The will clearly favors Garrett. If you try to fight it, you'll spend more than that on legal fees. This way everyone walks away peacefully. No hard feelings." I looked up at her. "No hard feelings?" She nodded. "Exactly. Your husband threw my daughter's sneakers into the rain." For the first time, Sloane's smile faltered. Only for a second. "Garrett can be impulsive," she admitted. "But he means well. He's under a tremendous amount of stress." "I'm sure he is." I folded the quitclaim deed, placed it back inside the envelope, and slid it across the bed toward her. I never sign legal documents without taking the time to review them properly. I told Sloane calmly, "I don't sign legal documents under pressure, especially not in a motel room. If Garrett has an offer, he can present it through Mr. Voss." She slowly got to her feet. The friendly smile she'd arrived with had completely disappeared. "You're making this much more difficult than it has to be." "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I'm simply making sure it's fair." Without another word, she walked out. She even left the envelope behind. I picked it up, walked over to the trash can, and dropped it inside. At 8:30 that morning, Gwen called. "The financial statements have been delivered to Voss's office," she said. "Everything is certified, sealed, and complete." Kowalski personally signed off on the package. "Thanks." Her voice became more serious. "Be careful. When they open that financial statement in front of people who've spent years believing you're broke, you already know what's going to happen." I did know. I'd replayed the scene over and over in my mind. The forensic accountant in me had already predicted everyone's reaction. Garrett's disbelief, Sloane's panic, and Carol's confusion. Those numbers would reveal a story none of them had ever bothered to ask about. Net worth, $5,830,000. The first page broke everything down clearly. $2.4 million from selling the majority of my accounting firm. $1.9 million invested in diversified index funds. $1.1 million in commercial real estate, 2 office buildings in Columbus that I'd purchased and managed myself. Another $430,000 spread across retirement accounts and cash reserves. Every single dollar had been earned through my own work. No inheritance. No family money. No wealthy spouse. Just 17 years of becoming exceptionally good at a profession my family had always dismissed as just a hobby. "I know exactly what's going to happen," I told Gwen. She paused. "Are you ready for it?" I looked over at Nora. She sat cross-legged on the motel bed, carefully braiding the floppy ears of her stuffed rabbit with complete concentration. She was only 7 years old. Yet she'd spent the past 2 weeks living in a motel because her uncle decided she didn't belong in her grandmother's home. She'd overheard Sloane saying, "This isn't really her house." She'd packed her own backpack without anyone asking because she was already learning that being a Merritt girl meant expecting no one to carry your burdens for you. I took a slow breath. "I'm ready." "Good," Gwen replied. "Call me afterward." She hesitated before adding one last sentence. "And Brooke." "Yeah." "Make them read the number out loud." For the first time that morning, I almost smiled. Almost. Before I walked into that meeting, I kept thinking about something. People had spent the last 2 weeks telling me to compromise, to sign the papers, to keep the peace, to accept my place. Funny how often people ask for peace when they're the ones benefiting from your silence. Thursday, 10 a.m. Raymond Voss's law office. The conference room smelled faintly of old leather and lemon polish. A large walnut table, built decades earlier by my grandfather, stood in the center of the room. 6 chairs surrounded it. A framed landscape hung on one wall. At the head of the table sat 2 neatly arranged folders waiting for Mr. Voss. Garrett arrived first. Charcoal suit. Pocket square. Rolex watch gleaming beneath the overhead lights. He pulled out a chair with complete confidence and sat down like a man expecting applause. Sloane followed behind him. She already had her phone in her hand, probably preparing whatever celebratory social media post she'd planned for later. Aunt Carol arrived next. She clutched her purse tightly with both hands and wore the same fleece vest she'd had on when she visited the motel. She offered me a quiet nod before choosing the seat farthest away from Garrett. I sat directly across from my brother. Nora stayed behind with the babysitter. Whatever happened in this room, she didn't need to witness it. Inside my handbag, next to Dad's carpenter's pencil, rested the small brass key. As sunlight spilled across the conference table, something suddenly clicked in my mind. The key my father had handed me when I turned 18, the one attached to the cracked leather keychain, the same key I'd tried using after Garrett changed the house locks, had never actually been the front door key. It was too old, too small. The grooves didn't even match. It had never belonged to the house. It belonged to the boathouse, the river property. My father had unknowingly given me the key to those 18 acres the day I became an adult. I'd carried it for 17 years without ever understanding what it really unlocked. A moment later, Raymond Voss entered the room. He quietly closed the door behind him and took his seat. He rested both hands on the 2 folders before speaking. "We'll begin with your father's will. After that," he continued, "we'll address the final section." Garrett leaned back confidently. He smiled. Mr. Voss opened the first folder. Last will and testament of Thomas Edward Merritt, revised 18 months ago. Properly witnessed and notarized in Washington County, Ohio. He calmly read through the standard legal provisions first. Payment of outstanding debts. Funeral expenses. Appointment of the estate's executor. Then he reached the section everyone had been waiting for. To my son, Garrett Thomas Merritt, I leave the following. The residential property located at 14 Maple Lane, Marietta, Ohio, including all improvements. The commercial property at 312 3rd Street, known as Merritt & Son Woodworks, together with its remaining inventory, fixtures, and equipment. And all real property comprising the homestead parcel as recorded in Washington County property records. Garrett leaned back in his chair. He didn't grin. He did something even more irritating. He slowly nodded, as though the entire reading was simply confirming what he'd believed all along. Then Mr. Voss continued. To my daughter, Brooke Ellen Merritt, I leave my personal toolbox, hand tools, and woodworking equipment. That was all. One brief sentence. 35 years of being Thomas Merritt's daughter had been reduced to an old green toolbox and a handful of worn carpenter's tools. Aunt Carol quietly let out a breath. Across the table, Sloane had already started typing on her phone. Garrett turned toward me with a smug smile. I told you, he said. The land always stays with the Merritt son. His words echoed through the room like a victory speech he'd rehearsed for years. I'm sorry it turned out this way, Brooke, he added. But Dad made his decision. He always knew who his real heir was. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked at Raymond Voss. He calmly returned my gaze, looking almost amused. Mr. Merritt, he said evenly, we're not finished. Garrett casually waved his hand. What else is there? She got the toolbox. I got the property. End of story. No, Voss replied firmly. It is not. He closed the first folder before placing his hand on the second one. Your father's will contains one final provision. Under its terms, I am legally required to read it before any property can be transferred. Garrett's confidence didn't disappear. If anything, it became stronger. He actually stood from his chair as though preparing to celebrate his own victory. A final provision, he repeated.
Fine.
Read it. Then he pointed directly at me. My sister walked away from this family when she was 18. She moved to Columbus. She got herself some office job pushing numbers. She never worked in the shop. She never maintained the property. She never carried the family name. I did. Every single year. Every holiday. Every time something broke. Every time the roof leaked. Every time Dad needed someone to co-sign. He suddenly stopped speaking. For just a split second. Then corrected himself. I stayed. She left. That's the equation. It always has been. He looked straight into my eyes. 41 years of entitlement sat behind that stare. I hope you enjoy being homeless, Brooke. I made sure you get absolutely nothing. The exact same words. The exact same script. He'd said them over the phone 6 days earlier. Now he was repeating them in front of witnesses. As though saying them twice would somehow make them true. Sloane silently nodded beside him. Aunt Carol lowered her eyes. Mr. Voss simply waited. The way only someone can wait. When they've already read the next page. Once Garrett finally sat back down, Voss opened the second folder. The final provision of Thomas Merritt's will, he began, concerns a parcel of land that is not included in the homestead inheritance. He looked down at the document. Specifically, 18 acres of debt-free riverfront property in Washington County, including the structure commonly known as the boathouse. Current appraised value. Approximately $1,100,000. Garrett blinked. Sloane stopped typing. Aunt Carol slowly lifted her head. Mr. Voss continued. This property is subject to a conditional inheritance. Your father attached specific instructions that I am now required to carry out. He removed a single sheet of heavy cream-colored legal paper from the folder. I recognized it immediately. The kind of paper reserved for documents meant to last generations. I'll read Mr. Merritt's words exactly as he wrote them. He adjusted his glasses and began. I, Thomas Edward Merritt, being of sound mind, direct that the 18-acre riverfront parcel, Washington County Parcel Number 04-117-20, together with all structures located upon it, shall not be included in the homestead transfer. This land has remained in the Merritt family for 4 generations. I have watched it protected, improved, and respected. I have also watched other family property become burdened with debt and nearly disappear. I refuse to let this land suffer the same fate. Garrett shifted uneasily in his chair. Mr. Voss continued reading. Therefore, I direct my executor to require each of my children to submit a verified financial statement prepared and certified by an independent certified public accountant. The 18-acre parcel shall pass to whichever child demonstrates the financial ability to preserve the property free of mortgages, liens, or any financial encumbrance for a minimum period of 10 years. He paused briefly. The only sound left in the room came from the ticking clock on the wall. Then he finished. If neither child satisfies this requirement, the land shall be sold and every dollar donated to the Washington County Land Conservancy. Mr. Voss slowly lowered the paper. Then he read the final sentence. I spent most of my life believing land belongs to the son. I was wrong. Land should belong to the person capable of protecting it. Those words struck me harder than I expected. My father, the same man who once told 15-year-old me that I was never going to stay, the same man who never asked about my career, had written those words alone inside a lawyer's office, knowing they'd remain long after he was gone. Aunt Carol quietly gasped. Garrett didn't say a single word. Mr. Voss placed the document back on the table. Both financial statements have already been submitted. I will now review them. He opened 2 sealed envelopes. The first belonged to Garrett. Verified financial statement of Garrett Thomas Merritt, prepared by Henderson Accounting, Parkersburg, West Virginia. He scanned the first page. Total assets. Residential property located at 14 Maple Lane. Estimated market value, $410,000. The commercial building on 3rd Street carried an estimated value of $95,000. Personal vehicles and bank accounts totaled $11,400. Voss paused before continuing. Total liabilities. Second mortgage on 14 Maple Lane. Outstanding balance, $298,000. Supplier lien against the 3rd Street workshop, $42,000. Private personal loans, $87,000. Credit card debt, $31,000. The conference room became perfectly still. Every number settled over the table like heavy smoke. Finally, Voss looked down at the final line. Net worth. He spoke with the same calm precision as before. Negative $41,600. Garrett's face tightened instantly. Beside him, Sloan reached for his arm. This is temporary, Garrett argued quickly. The business is recovering. The debts are being refinanced. Once probate finishes and I sell a few assets. Mr. Merritt, Voss interrupted without raising his voice. The condition in your father's will evaluates demonstrated financial capacity at the time of filing. Not future expectations. Not projections. Not optimistic assumptions. Your verified statement establishes insolvency. Garrett protested. The house alone is worth over $400,000. Voss answered immediately. And that same property carries approximately $340,000 in secured debt created with your participation and later assumed by your father. You did not inherit a valuable asset, Mr. Merritt. You inherited a financial burden. For the first time since Mother's funeral, Garrett actually looked at me. Not through me. Not beyond me. At me. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear. Not fear of me. Fear of numbers. Fear of mathematics. Fear of the simple truth that every decision he'd made had finally reached its balance sheet. His voice became rough. Read hers. My sister's. Voss picked up the second sealed envelope. Brooke Ellen Merritt. Verified financial statement prepared by Kowalski and Associates. Independent certified public accountant. He turned the page. The room became so quiet that I could hear Aunt Carol breathing. Total assets. He read every item with the same measured tone. Remaining ownership proceeds from Merritt Forensic Group. $2.4 million. Diversified investment portfolio. $1.9 million. Commercial real estate holdings. 2 office properties in the Columbus metropolitan area. $1.1 million. Retirement accounts. $280,000. Cash and liquid reserves. $150,000.
Sloane made a strange sound. Not quite a gasp.
Not quite a word. Just the involuntary noise someone makes when reality arrives far too quickly. Voss continued. Total liabilities. 0. No outstanding loans. No mortgages. No liens. No financial encumbrances of any kind. He gently placed the document back onto the table. Verified net worth. $5,830,000. The number exploded through the room without anyone raising their voice. $5.83 million. Every dollar earned. Every dollar built by my own work.
Garrett stared at me.
His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. Aunt Carol covered her mouth with both hands. Sloane sat frozen. Her phone rested forgotten in her lap. Her face had gone completely pale. I remained silent. There was nothing left to explain. Inside my bag, my fingers rested on the carpenter's pencil. TM-BM. Tom Merritt. To Brooke Merritt. Voss broke the silence. Under the conditions established in Thomas Merritt's will, Brooke Merritt is the only beneficiary who satisfies the financial requirements. The 18-acre riverfront property, including the boathouse, is hereby awarded to Brooke Merritt. He turned toward Garrett. Mr. Merritt, do you have any questions? Garrett's hands lay flat against the walnut table. His fingers spread wide as though he were trying to keep himself from falling. His face had lost every trace of color. His breathing became shallow, barely audible. 5. He whispered. 5 million. Voss quietly corrected him. 5.83 million. Raymond Voss believed numbers mattered. Even then, the next moment, Garrett's eyes rolled backward. His body collapsed. He struck the chair before sliding onto the floor. The chair slammed into the conference table. A glass of water tipped over, rolled across the polished walnut surface my grandfather had built decades earlier, and spilled around the legal folders like a slow-moving tide. Sloane screamed. It was short, sharp, more shock than sorrow. She rushed toward him. Aunt Carol jumped to her feet so quickly that her purse slipped from her shoulder, sending coins across the hardwood floor. Voss's assistant was already calling emergency services. He's breathing, she said after checking his pulse. Rapid heartbeat. But steady. Most likely a vasovagal fainting episode. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't stand. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. Watching the man who had thrown my daughter's shoes into the rain collapse because a legal document revealed the truth about his sister didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought something else. Exhaustion. The deep, quiet exhaustion of a woman who had spent 35 years being underestimated and had finally watched the numbers tell the story for her. Across the room, Sloane knelt beside Garrett, desperately fanning him with one of the legal folders. Carol remained against the wall, both hands pressed to her face, staring into space as if she were trying to process everything that had just happened. Voss stayed seated at the head of the table, his hands calmly folded. He waited with the quiet patience of someone who had watched people collapse under the weight of truth before and knew he would see it happen again. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old brass key attached to its cracked leather fob. I placed it carefully on the table beside the scattered water, the legal folders, and the shattered remains of my brother's confidence. It was the boathouse key, the key to the river property, the same key my father had handed me when I turned 18, the day I left home, the day he quietly said, "For when you come home." I had finally come home, and somehow, home had come back to me. The paramedics arrived about 11 minutes later. By then, Garrett was sitting upright in a chair with a cold pack pressed against his forehead, while Sloane hovered over him like someone trying to repair a disaster she hadn't expected. The EMTs checked his blood pressure, shined a light into his eyes, and advised him to go to the hospital for further evaluation. He refused. Of course he did. Merritt men didn't ride in ambulances. After the paramedics left, Garrett looked across the table at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It looked broken. "You knew," he whispered. "You sat there knowing." "I knew I had built a successful career," I answered. "I knew I had earned everything I owned. But I didn't know any of it would matter in that room until a week ago." "You hid it. You let all of us believe. You let me believe. You wanted me to make a fool of myself." I met his eyes. "No, Garrett. You chose what kind of man you wanted to be. I never made a single decision for you." His jaw shook. Then came the self-pity. Exactly as expected. "I stayed, Brooke. I stayed here. I ran the shop. I did everything Dad wanted. I sacrificed everything for this family. And now I'm drowning in debt while you're sitting on almost $6 million. And the land is. The land belongs to someone who won't lose it." The voice didn't belong to me. It came from Carol. Everyone turned toward her. She was still standing by the wall, tears silently tracing the lines on her face. "I gave up 40 acres, she said quietly. "I handed them over to my brother, because that was the rule. Boys inherited land. And that rule ruined my life." She wiped her eyes. "That rule took everything from me." She looked directly at Garrett. "Your father was wrong. My father was wrong. And I was wrong for telling Brooke to accept it." Then she looked at me. "I'm sorry." For the first time, I believed she truly meant those words. But sincerity could never erase history. Some damage stays long after the apology arrives. 3 months later, the Maple Lane house entered foreclosure. Garrett couldn't keep up with the second mortgage my father had taken out to rescue him. The bank filed foreclosure papers in November. 2 weeks before the sheriff's sale, Sloan moved out. She removed the inexpensive cabinets she'd installed over my grandfather's original woodwork. The stained glass window above the front door stayed behind. It was simply too heavy to carry away. Garrett challenged the will in court. His attorney filed a motion against the conditional inheritance. Voss responded with the will, the financial statements, the inheritance condition, and 8 pages of Ohio case law supporting conditional bequests. 16 days later, the judge dismissed the case. The written ruling was only 1 paragraph long. Its final sentence read, "The testator's condition is clear, lawful, and fully enforceable." After that, Garrett never called me again. Carol mailed me a Christmas card. There wasn't a message inside. Only her signature. I never replied. But I didn't throw it away either. Some debts take longer to settle than others. That January, I took Nora to the river property for the first time since the will reading. The sycamore trees stood bare. The river rolled past, gray and cold beneath the winter sky. The boathouse door still stuck halfway open just like it always had. I slipped the brass key into the lock. It turned effortlessly, almost as though it had been waiting for me all those years. Inside, everything remained. Dad's fishing rods, an old folding chair, a coffee can filled with hooks and sinkers, and the familiar scent of cedar, the same smell that had filled the workshop, the toolbox. Every Saturday morning of my childhood before my father convinced himself I wasn't meant to inherit any of it, Nora skipped toward the riverbank, happily tossing stones into the water. I sat on the wooden steps of the boathouse and sharpened the carpenter's pencil with my pocket knife. TM, BM. Tom Merritt. To Brooke Merritt. On a small scrap of wood, I drew the very first line. It was the beginning of a workshop I planned to build for Nora. A place where she would never have to question whether her name mattered. Garrett once told me, "Hope you enjoy being homeless." I looked across 18 acres of debt-free riverfront land. Then I smiled quietly. I was home. Real worth isn't handed to the loudest person. It isn't reserved for the child with the right gender. And it isn't measured by who stayed behind. Worth is measured by what you build yourself. And what you can carry without depending on anyone else. My father learned that lesson too late to tell me face to face. But he learned it just in time to write it down. That's my story. A green metal toolbox. 18 acres beside a river. And a brother who discovered far too late what nothing was really worth. If someone in your own family ever told you that you'd never amount to anything, that the name, the land, or the legacy would never belong to you, then go build something no one can ever take away. And when you do, come back and tell me your story.